Okay, so first a patch from scratch video on the new channel. We're going to keep things quite simple and go for kind of an analog style pad, but I think you'll agree it has a really nice sound to it, and I'm going to play that for you now. So we're going to start in Oscillator A, and we're going to go with this Juno wavetable. I absolutely love this. This is like one of my go-to wavetables, especially for analog sounds. And we're just going to cycle through to this Juno saw wave. Most of the time with pads, people use unison a lot to add a lot of width. However, this does inherently give it a very digital sound. So when I'm going for an analog pad, I prefer instead to keep the unison at 1. If we do want to create width, we can go into the global tab here, and we have Serum 2's new voice controls. Right now at the top, we have all of the oscillators selected. We're going to just focus on here for now. And every time I press a note, you can see each of these different 8 slots is sequentially highlighted. Every time a new note is played, what Serum does in the voice control is skip to this next slot. What I can do is set each of these voices to a different left or right pan. And you can see it now alternates every time I press a note. However, if I press more than one note, it's actually going to use more than one of these slots. Instantly we get a very wide sound. Now I'm going to dial this back just a little, and now if we play our chords, they're really nice and wide. We can also add some randomness to this. This is basically emulating what a lot of analog synths have, which is a spread control, which does exactly this. The other thing we can do is go into this detune panel here, and we can do exactly the same thing, but for each individual voice's tuning. This can add a really nice kind of analog pitch drift. Now, instead of setting it manually, what I'm going to do for this is just set a detune random amount. This goes all the way up to 20 cents, which is quite detuned. I'm actually going to dial this back to about halfway, about 10 cents or so. And you can hear instantly this is sounding much more in the realm of an analog pad. I really love this kind of area in Serum where you can get a modern sound, but kind of taking the best bits of analog sound design as well. It's really cool. Going back into our main page, we're just going to give it a little bit more shape, a bit of a pad-like amplitude envelope, soften the attack, bring down the sustain, and maybe a tiny bit of release as well. Next, we're going to shape the frequencies. We're just going to stick with a basic Moog modeled low pass 12 dB filter. If you didn't know, these MG filters are the kind of Moog modeled filters, so a bit more analog character to them, and then these are just the normal digital ones. So that's kind of taming some of that digital brightness. We can also add some noise just to kind of fill out the frequency spectrum a bit. I really like to use this color white noise. I'll just turn the filter off for now so you can hear this. Now, for the stereo width of the noise, we basically have 2 options. We can use this stereo control here. And you can hear that makes it much wider, but what I want to do for this sound in particular is keep this at 0, and we're going to do the same thing we did for the width of Oscillator A in the voice control. So now if we click the noise oscillator here, the same panning will also apply to the noise oscillator. This means that the sound is going to be much more consistent, and the noise is going to be panned with the saw waves. As you can tell, that just sounds much more cohesive. It kind of glues the noise and the oscillator together. So let's get our filter back on and also route the noise through it. We could also bump up the resonance a little. And we can set up a separate envelope here to modulate the filter cutoff. We can either have a kind of plucky envelope like this, or we can have a more sustained envelope similar to the original pad and maybe just soften up the attack. It kind of depends if you want more of a pad or kind of like a key pad hybrid. Moving into the effects, the first thing I like to use sometimes on pads like this that are very wide is actually a utility plugin to mono the kind of low end. What this does is just make sure that frequencies below a certain frequency are mono and not being pushed out too far left or right, because it can sound a little bit weird when low frequencies are really kind of like hard panned. Next, I just used a high pass EQ to roll off some of those lows. Now, if you go quite extreme with this, then this mono bass isn't completely necessary. I was just targeting frequencies under about 100 Hz with this. Also, just to give it a bit of more of an analog sound, just tame some of the highs. This is so that even if we do open up our filter, it's not too bright and you can kind of adjust this to your own taste. Next, we can add some chorus. And finally, some whole reverb. One preset I really like, and that is kind of a go-to for me, is if you go into Factory and go to Whole Luxury, what I usually do is bring down this depth amount, and for this pad, probably the decay as well. Now, depending on your pad, you could get away with a higher decaying reverb, like a longer reverb, but because our MIDI here is actually quite quick for a pad, it's not really being held down for long here, we don't want kind of like clashing reverb tails from chord to chord, which is why we're keeping it quite short. So a few macros we might want to set up to automate is the filter cutoff, maybe also the reverb and the chorus. Now we can dial these in until we get the sound we're looking for. So yeah, I hope you found this helpful, and thanks a lot for watching. Feel free to check out my presets over at synthetica.com, and I'll catch you in the next video.